Nations entity on women, which is UN Women, an entity delivering programs, policies, and standards that uphold women's rights and ensure that every woman and girl lives up to her full potential. And we just want to congratulate really the Zimbabwe Gender Commission and the government of Zimbabwe for taking this bold step to do a national study on violence against women in politics. It is one of the few cutting-edge global studies that have come on the global scene. A few other countries have done similar studies, but not more than 10. I know of Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, and I think in Africa this is one of the few that Zimbabwe has done. So let us really clap hands for them for taking on this initiative. Ending violence against women is one of UN's top priorities. And in Zimbabwe, the United Nations has funded a number of initiatives on ending violence against women. UN Women supports member states to promote women's equal participation in political and public life. And at large, part of that work is ensuring a safe environment free from violence for them to realize their political rights. The United Nations support evidence-based policy and advocacy, develop tools for global data collection, provide technical assistance to national partners, strengthen monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and provide capacity building to national parties. Within the UN system, the UN Women provide thought leadership and practice leadership that has influenced coordination efforts to address the issues through the country programming, high-level advocacy, and coordination with UN partners, especially in terms of influencing gender equalities in issues to do with elections. UN Women's work on violence against women is underpinned by an updated normative framework. Our normative mandate has propelled us to support global and regional normative developments and frameworks to identify measures, mitigate, and prevent violence against women in politics. In 2021, the report of the Secretary General for the 65th session on the Commission of the Status of Women, CSW, recognized violence as a violation of women's political rights and a major barrier to their participation. The CSW 65 agreed conclusions call on member states to create a safe and enabling environment for women to exercise their political rights and outline steps to be taken. Other regional normative frameworks, such as the Maputo Protocol and the SADC Protocol, also have provisions which are instructive. And may I also hasten to say that the set of concluding observations for Zimbabwe in the last report also pointed to the need for the government of Zimbabwe to take all measures that are necessary to prevent violence against women in politics, which had been identified as a major hindrance and a barrier to why the numbers of women's political participation continue to be regressing. As we launch this report today, it is important in taking stock as a country, as we will mark the 30th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women and the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action next year in 2025, as well as the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. These anniversaries not only provide an opportunity for us to review the progress made in advancing gender equality agenda, but also offer a platform to bolster global action towards gender equality and responsive implementation of the 2030 Agenda and other global commitments. So within this study, we've learned a number of the challenges that continue to hinder the progress towards our gender equality commitments. The government of Zimbabwe has also recently launched the National Action Plan on Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions on women, peace and security. And these are all important developments that resonate with some of the findings that we have had in the study today. Accelerating the fulfillment of global commitments to gender equality is crucial in a context where more than half of the endpoint of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where not a single country has achieved gender equality, thereby putting the achievement of the entire agenda at risk. The gender gap in decision-making and leadership positions remains entrenched, and at the current rate of progress, gender parity will not be reached in national legislatures before 2063, or among heads of government before 2150. And this, the United Nations recognize, will take another 100, if not 130 years away if we do not address some of these issues related to violence against women in politics. No country is close to eradicating violence against women and girls, including intimate partner violence, violence against women in politics, with an estimated 736 million, almost 1 in 3, subjected to violence at least once in their lifetime. So when you look at some of the shocking statistics we've seen here today, it is not just a Zimbabwean problem, but a global problem. Violence and harassment against women in public life has increased, and more women have, as more women have gained power. Despite disturbing levels of violence against women legislators, most countries still lack adequate laws to prevent sexual harassment in parliaments and in politics in general. We therefore recommend that government can adopt new laws, standalone laws to prohibit or criminalize violence against women in politics, or integrate adequate provisions onto the existing ending violence against women laws. Parliaments can also take measures to ensure that the institution itself, when we look at the National Assembly, as we looked at this study, you notice that the consultant mainly focused on those that are candidates that had been elected. And the shocking statistic is that when you look at Zimbabwe with the low numbers of women that we have in parliament, if 97% of them has experienced violence, it means those women, though they carry a brave face throughout their representation, but they are also suffering trauma silently. It means that the space is not safe. Therefore, Parliament can also take measures to ensure that the institution itself is free from violence and harassment during pre- and post-electoral period. We can take an example, for example, Canada. The House of Commons adopted a code of conduct for members who are expected to maintain a work environment free of sexual harassment and any other form of violence, and they must sign a pledge within 30 or 60 days after their election to the House. So these are some innovative measures that can also be introduced in our own parliament. We continue to encourage government to adopt and effectively enforce institutional codes of conduct, establish monitoring and reporting mechanisms, revise existing ones, stating zero tolerance to any form of violence and intimidation and other forms of violence that continue to inhibit or prohibit women's participation in politics and decision-making, as per the new released General Recommendation 40 that has come up. Several countries have also dealt with aspects of discrimination and harassment in order to ensure that the younger generations of women continue to participate in the field of politics, recognizing that it can be safer and it can be better. Distinguished guests, the task for us all is now to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 5 and leave a lasting legacy of a world and a country where women and girls in all their diversity have the same rights as enshrined in the international human rights treaties and safe from violence. Thank you.
Madam Fatu, UN Women Country Representative, for speaking to us from the international perspective, sharing with us some of the best practices, some lessons learned from our...
We see that in terms of the violence that was perpetrated against women, the men perpetrated the most violence. If you look at supporters of opponents, 38% of men perpetrated violence against women as compared to 1.3% of women who perpetrated violence against their fellow women. But if you look at the violence that was perpetrated by both parties, you can actually see that it's quite high when men and women are combined in perpetrating the violence. Still looking at the acts of violence, during nomination, 96% of candidates were party nominated who experienced violence, and 4% were self-nominated. So this suggests that women who are in political parties experience more violence than independent candidates. Women across political divides also experienced violence during nomination process, with economic violence and candidate imposition being the highest or the most acute. In terms of economic violence, there were high nomination fees. For instance, if you look at the first past the post candidates, they had to fork out $1,000 in terms of nomination fees. And this figure rose from $50 during the 2018 elections to an astronomical figure of $1,000 on the 2023 elections. Even if you look at, for instance, presidential candidates, they had to pay $20,000 for them to qualify for the presidential race. And as a result, we only had one female candidate contesting in the presidential race. Candidate imposition was also another factor that affected women during the 2023 election. Replacement of names by a female or male candidate, or even missing names from the official papers. Also, policies and positions were changed overnight to suit some influential party members' needs. Also, women struggled to be nominated even if they were qualified to contest for the seats. VWAP was also a major deterrent to women campaigning during the campaign period, particularly those women who were vying for the first past the post seats where there was stiff competition with men. As a result, women preferred the safer spaces for competing, and they ended up fighting for the proportional representation seats, which is why you see that we had violence which was perpetrated by other women against other women. So that violence was perpetrated when they were fighting and vying for the proportional representation seats. The main types of violence which were experienced included sexual harassment, emotional and verbal abuse, economic violence, cyberbullying. Those were all the types of violence that were perpetrated, even physical violence. And physical violence included abduction and torture. These are the findings from the women we interviewed. Economic violence also, lack of finances for campaigning during the primary and general elections, especially in urban areas. Verbal abuse, hate speech, and threats from both men and women were experienced to decampaign the candidates. In terms of use of media, print and social media were used to campaign by the candidates, and coverage was mainly online, and community radio stations were also used, and private newspapers. But there was unfair coverage where women were disadvantaged and men were mostly favored in terms of coverage. And some female candidates preferred not to use social media so that they could avoid cyberbullying, which is really sad because we are now in a fast-pacing technological advanced age, and women could not use social media because of the fear of cyberbullying. And then looking at the main perpetrators of violence against women, looking at online violence, these were mostly members from the opposing political party who perpetrated that violence, followed by someone within their political parties, and then also some of them didn't know who was actually committing the cyberbullying. The main perpetrators of violence against women were actually senior members of political parties, and these were mostly men, with 72.2% of men perpetrating violence against women, as compared to other party members from other political parties. In terms of family and political party support, most candidates claimed that they had support from their family, particularly from their husbands and children. They received moral support, cash, and in-kind support. And they also received support in terms of campaign materials like posters and T-shirts from their parties. But there was also negative connotations that also came through when we were interviewing these women. Some women faced violence from their in-laws, from other relatives who did not want them to participate in politics, and some even from their husbands who feared that the violence that was being experienced at the campaign trail would actually spill over into their households. In terms of support from their political parties, women received a lot of support from their political parties. They received about 81% of support from their political parties. And we now look at the nature of that support. About 37.3% of women received financial support from their political parties, which was quite low. But in terms of technical and legal advice, they received 84.8%, which was quite high. 27% of the respondents faced violence against women during the polling days. So whilst the environment was generally peaceful, there was violence that women experienced during the polling days, which was about 22.7%. And the violence mainly came from local observers at the polling stations as they sought to influence the voting process. Female agents were also victims of violence during polling days. Also, in terms of the post-election period, violence was also experienced by women. And the following are the types of violence that women experienced just during the post-election period. Witch hunts were conducted where leaders of political parties, senior leaders, wanted to find out who didn't vote for who. Denial of free benefits that are distributed by the government was also prevalent, like agricultural inputs, especially for those who were thought to be guilty of crossing over to the other side. Women were also divided along political party lines. There was lack of respect for female policymakers, particularly in parliament, where there was heckling in parliament. Also, women were also recalled from parliament. And statistics attest to the fact that almost 75% of women, or those who were recalled, were actually women. There was lack of access to constituencies and resources for PR list policymakers, and they are labeled and there's name calling, and those seats are called Bakosi seats, which is a derogatory. So you can see that women experience violence during the pre-election, the polling days, and also the post-election period. So let's look at reporting and help-seeking behavior. Do women report violence that is perpetrated against them? Our findings suggest that most women do not report when they face violence during elections. In terms of the cases that were reported to the police, we found out that those cases, according to the women, received no attention from the police. The perpetrators were not punished, and most women did not get the outcome they expect. So they were dissatisfied with the handling of the police in terms of the reports that they made about the violence that they were experiencing during elections. Let's look at the multi-party liaison committees. The committee also was said not to be effective in handling cases of violence. Reported cases were tabled down, but at the end, no tangible action was taken against the perpetrators. Also looking at the independent commissions, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission and ZGC, the women did say that they were not aware that they could actually go and report to these institutions. And these institutions are mandated by the Constitution to take in complaints related to gender discrimination. So there was no information in terms of how women could report to these two institutions during the 2023 elections. What were the consequences, or what are the consequences of violence against women in politics? Looking at the 2023 elections, these were the consequences: reduced campaign activities due to fear. Some women said they had to withdraw, particularly the aspiring candidates, because of the violence they were experiencing on the campaign trail. And there was one candidate who actually said, when you're campaigning, it's like you're in the Serengeti. It's like you're in the jungle. And it's dog eat dog, survival of the fittest in terms of the violence that women experienced. There was low participation of female candidates because they were discouraged by their family and their friends, particularly those who were concerned about the safety of these women. And some women, however, have actually been strong enough, and they've gone through the challenges and obstacles and still managed to win seats for the first past the post seats. So what are our conclusions? Our conclusions are that violence is rampant throughout the electoral cycle in Zimbabwe. Looking at the pre-election period, the election period, the post-election period, as I have highlighted. The violence is both intra-party violence within the party itself and inter-party within the parties that is perpetrated. And this is against both men and women. Women who perpetrate the violence against others, they are part of a patriarchal system that undermines female leadership to maintain male dominance. It's because of the political culture that views women as subordinate individuals that has been perpetuated. This political culture is not only found in Zimbabwe, but across Africa, across the globe. Families of candidates usually offer support in terms of moral support, sometimes financial support, but however, there are others who do not support female candidates because of the fear of violence. There's also a culture of impunity, particularly by the perpetrators of violence, because nothing really is done to them, and there is no deterrence to deter them from stopping these acts of violence. So what are our recommendations? In terms of legal and policy reforms, the study recommends that there be implementation of legislation and policies that address violence against women in politics and hold political parties accountable to gender equality and women empowerment commitments. Our constitution is very clear in section 17 that there should be gender balance, in section 56 that there should be non-discrimination, and also in section 80. We should also align our constitution to our electoral act to constitutional provisions of gender equality and gender balance. And these provisions also align with international commitments and international provisions, particularly if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, number 5, which focuses on gender equality. Also, ZEC should be empowered through legislation and policies to disqualify candidates who are the perpetrators of violence at intra and across political party levels. ZEC should also be empowered to stop an election in any province or in any district or polling station if there are incidences of violence. Also, there should be enactment and enforcement of laws that specifically criminalize violence against women in politics, looking at all types of political violence. Still looking at legal and policy reforms, the existing laws that are existing in Zimbabwe on gender-based violence should be strengthened so that they also include political violence. Sanctions should be clear and introduced, and consequences for party violence, political party violence, should be faced by the perpetrators of political violence. Recommendations to the Ministry of Women Affairs: it should provide leadership training, mentoring programs, and capacity building for women in politics so that they can help mitigate the effects of violence against women. Also, the ministry must raise awareness among citizens on the issues of gender equality and equity at the national level to shift mindset and change the political culture so that women can be accepted as equal and capable leaders in society. The ministry should also collaborate with the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education to ensure that gender equality is included in the education curriculum so that girls and boys grow up knowing about the gender provisions in the Constitution and also in international commitments. Looking at recommendations on Chapter 12 institutions, they should be strengthened in terms of their mandate so that they can also be able to protect women against violence in politics. They must also raise awareness on the complaints mechanism among women politicians so that they can seek remedies when they experience violence against themselves. Also, resources should be mobilized to implement protection mechanisms for women who face violence during elections. Looking at ZEC again, ZEC should conduct awareness programs to sensitize political parties and voters about violence against women in politics. And also, ZEC should also ensure that candidates sign a strengthened code of conduct that they can commit to so that we can stop this scourge of violence against women in politics. It is mainly because there are no punitive measures in the code of conduct. That is the reason why there is so much violence against women in politics. And also, multi-party liaison committees should be strengthened so that they can effectively respond to violence against women in politics. In terms of parliament, parliament must replicate structures of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus at the provincial and district levels so that they can advocate for women's rights and also dissuade perpetrators of violence against women in politics from further committing it. The police should strengthen the capacity of the victim-friendly unit to respond to all protection needs of women around the electoral cycle. The police should also conduct thorough investigations on reports of acts of violence and arrest the perpetrators. They should provide training and awareness amongst the police on violence against women. Looking at political parties, there should be reforms in political parties. They should establish internal codes of conduct that they are going to abide by, which prohibit violence against women, including intimidation and harassment. They should also provide inclusive leadership and actively promote women's participation so that they are also placed in senior positions in political parties so that they can influence policy decisions. Women also should have access to safe and confidential channels to report violence within political parties. The registration of political parties is also another recommendation that can also give gender equality provisions as requirements. This can be made mandatory for all political parties. For instance, that each political parties should submit candidate lists for nomination which show gender parity. Parties should actively promote women's participation and ensure that women are placed in leadership positions. When we look at women's rights NGOs, they should capacitate women with knowledge, with skills, and access to the media and its use, as well as campaign finance, so that they can also campaign for the first past the post seats. They should hold public campaigns to shift public attitudes and reduce the incidence of violence against women in politics and beyond. Also, they should raise awareness on the reporting mechanisms that are available for women when they face violence throughout the electoral cycle. They should provide psychosocial counseling for women victims or survivors of violence. They should also lobby political parties to put in place measures that dedicated a certain proportion of their budget towards women's campaign financing, particularly because of the lack of economic resources that I highlighted earlier on. And also they should raise awareness among women on the Cybersecurity Act, the roles of the independent commissions in handling cases of violence against women in politics. They should lobby and advocate for the adoption of specific measures on campaign finance for women and gender equality. In terms of national legislation on political campaign finance and parties' expenditures, it should be made commensurate with the provisions and international conventions and agreements that promote gender equality. Also, the mandate of ZEC must be strengthened so that it can also monitor campaign spending and hold political parties to account for their campaign finances. Also, women should be capacitated so that they can transcend the name calling, the maligning, the labeling, of course the sexist labeling such as mahure and prostitute, because these are everyday microaggressions which they can transcend and also contest for the political positions that they desired. Also, platforms should be created for female candidates to share and support each other and learn from each other and be in solidarity as women in responding to those issues of violence against women in elections. Also, inclusive community dialogues are also helpful among women themselves so that they can dialogue and to provide recommendations that can also ensure that the scourge of violence against women is stopped. The media, in terms of traditional media, it should be sensitized regarding gender equality, women empowerment provisions, so that they can give specific and effective coverage to women candidates during the electoral cycle. Also, the media should raise awareness against violence against women in politics. Also, the media should also develop gender policies within the media fraternity itself and action plans that are aligned to the constitutional provisions of gender economic empowerment. And then also the skills should be strengthened for women to be proactive in terms of reacting to violence against women in politics. And then lastly, looking at traditional and religious leaders, they should engage in awareness-raising activities that promote women's political participation and leadership and avoid the negative consequences of violence against women in politics. Because most of the violence that is perpetrated in the rural areas where these traditional leaders are, and they should therefore be able to raise awareness against violence which women experience during elections. Thank you so much for listening attentively. I've come to the end of my presentation.
Can we give them a round of applause for all the information they've shared with us and some thought-provoking findings that we heard about.